Good morning. Hi, I'm Jeff Bowen. I'm the Director of Library Programming and Public Affairs. And on behalf of the entire Pepperdine Libraries team, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's talk by Kenneth A. Breisch. Here at Pepperdine Libraries, we make it our mission to positively impact learning in our everyday work. And I'm delighted that Dr. Breisch was willing to come here to speak about our Roadside Attraction exhibition and help place John Margolies' images in a broader context. Before we begin, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to our upcoming Chamber Music at Noon in Payson concert. The next one happening next Wednesday, November 12th at noon. I hope to see you here. And you can find this and all of our upcoming events on the library's website. Today's talk is being recorded. During the Q&A phase of the event, I'll be walking around with a microphone, and we kindly ask you to speak into the mic so it gets picked up on the recording. And then, of course, after the talk today, you are all invited to a reception in the exhibit gallery. We'll have sweet treats and coffee and sparkling water. Associate Professor Emeritus Ken Breisch holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. He taught in the School of Architecture at University of Southern California until his retirement in 2022 and served as the founder and director of graduate programs in historic preservation, now heritage conservation, from 1997 to 2011. He has published widely on American architectural history, including 3 volumes on the history of libraries: Henry Hobson Richardson and the Small Public Library in America, the Los Angeles Central Library, Building an Architectural Icon, 1872 to 1933, and American Libraries, 1730 to 1950, for the Library of Congress. Dr. Breisch is a past president of the Society of Architectural Historians and has served on the boards of the Society of Architectural and the Vernacular Architecture Forum. He was a Santa Monica Planning Commissioner from 1993 to 2000 and a board member of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, the Santa Monica Public Library, and the Santa Monica Landmarks Commission. Please join me in welcoming Ken Breisch.
Thank you very much. I try to stay out of trouble. So, this is a good thing to have. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Mark Russo, the Dean of the Libraries, and of course, Jeff Bowen, for inviting me here and also for putting together the exhibition, which you can see downstairs in the library, which is a lot of fun. I think you will agree, but there is a more, in a sense, serious side to what I think John was intending, although it's difficult to know what was going through his mind in a way as he traveled literally thousands of miles across the United States, photographing not just roadside architecture, which is the focus of this exhibition. Actually, if you go to the Library of Congress prints and photographs collection, you can see all 11,750 images that were collected by the Library of Congress. Thanks to the curator of architecture and design, Ford Petrus, who retired a number of years ago, but as I'll come back to, really continued to build the collection in a truly amazing way, in addition to the Margolies photographs. There are thousands of photographs by Carol Highsmith and also Camilo Vergara, who I'll touch upon at the end of this lecture. But for the most part, what I want to focus on is, of course, John Margolies and really his documentation of commercial vernacular architecture of the type that you can see here. Sometimes known as not so much this, but we'll see other examples of whales and other things you can see downstairs as mimetic or programmatic architecture, which often depicts the function of the building, which is really a 20th century and I would say American phenomena in a lot of ways that relate to, which I'll be coming back to the rise of automobile culture, which dominated American culture after the late 20s, even the early 20s in Los Angeles, into the 30s, and of course up to the present day. It was this cultural phenomenon in terms of vernacular, commercial vernacular architecture that John really wanted to document. Again, not to project, but I'll come back to how endangered this kind of architecture was and still is. I directed, as Jeff mentioned, the Historic Preservation Program, or now Heritage Conservation Program at USC. And this is among the most endangered type of architecture. Along with that, probably that is related to minority cultures in a lot of ways. It's not appreciated in the same way as, say, the Gamble House in Pasadena, which I think most, if not all of you, are familiar with. In any case, John, and I think I'll just refer to him as John. I didn't know him, but feel like I do now. Started to document this material in 1972, and over the next 36 years, accumulated more than 13,000 photographs using a Canon SRL or a Canon camera, primarily shooting color slides. That may be foreign territory to a lot of you, but it's important to remember. I mean, now, you know, we all have our iPhones or whatever, and we're clicking away all of the time. But it was a real project at the time still. I started photographing about the same time and used a Canon FTB, a big clunky thing that weighed 100 pounds, I think. But that was good because I tend to drop it and then bounce across the sidewalk and still work. But you know, you'd have to buy rolls of film, which wasn't cheap, and then bring it to Photoshop to have it processed. And that was even more expensive. So you were actually pretty careful about what you shot. You didn't just go out there and start clicking around. So with John, as I think some of you know from labels and other things in the exhibition, he carefully staged his photographs in a lot of ways. He traveled around in a big car. He loved big cars, would stay at cheap motels, get up at the crack of dawn so the light would be just right. I presume on one side of the road as opposed to the other, would maybe take one or two shots, and that would be it. It would have to work for him. As I'll come back to, these are, as I say, carefully staged in a lot of ways. There is a remarkable absence of people in the photographs. He'd shoo people away. He actually sometimes brought a broom with him so he could clean up in front of the buildings, which by the 1970s and 80s were often abandoned. And so he wanted this sort of monumental focus on these kinds of images. The most interesting thing, in a way, is that there are no automobiles, and this is car-oriented architecture. But he wanted to really sort of emphasize the monumental sort of quality of the architecture, waiting often for the sky to clear so you get this brilliant blue sky in the background that would further emphasize sort of the silhouette of the building itself. There are stories from people who occasionally traveled with him that if there were automobiles parked in front of the building, he, especially if it were a bar or a cafe, he'd go in and offer to buy people free drinks to move their cars so that he could get just the kind of shot that he wanted. And, you know, some of it, of course, is whimsical, what at the time was heavily criticized as kitsch or not serious in terms of the traditions of architectural history. But John felt otherwise. He later said that the commercial architecture by the side of the road is very important. It's America's definitive contribution to the art of design in the 20th century. And I think in that sense, he's probably right in that it stands apart from what was going on in the rest of the world. Not that there wasn't some degree of that in maybe Britain or Germany, and could say France, but the automobile just did not dominate culture the way that it did here, and this arose really to service automobile travelers, especially as you hit the blue highways, the early highways outside of the cities. Until recently, and John really helped to propel this, the study of this kind of architecture wasn't taken very seriously at all. If you were in art history, like I was, I'm a recovering art historian, or architectural history, it's not what we were looking at by and large. Of course, what was significant were the architectural monuments of the great geniuses of architecture, what we might call high style architecture. Probably many of you are familiar with the Barnsdall House by Frank Lloyd Wright here in Los Angeles. This was really the focus of the curriculum. Along with, of course, medieval architecture, Roman classicism, the Parthenon, on down through the ages in a lot of ways. What John was photographing was not this professionally designed architecture, architecture that reflects, historically significant architectural trends and designers. Created typically for a privileged or wealthy clientele who had to pay for, of course, the construction of these buildings. In contrast, he was looking at what we think of as vernacular architecture. Vernacular is actually defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as, quote, a native speech, a language or dialect of a country or place, the common everyday language of ordinary people in a particular locality. And it actually comes from the Roman Latin vernaculus, which is how they identified, I suppose you could think of London and York in England in a similar way, but it's the way they defined Latin as it was being what they thought of as mauled by the Germanic tribes, maybe in Germany. And of course, that evolved eventually into German and French and other Latin kinds of languages. But it was the language that was spoken by the people. And only relatively recently has that term started to be applied to the study of architectural history. Relatively recently. And early on, again, in terms of a kind of seriousness, what was being looked at were really wonderful buildings like this from the 18th century. This is a Dutch house in the Hudson River Valley that was seen as a reflection, really, of Dutch culture as it was introduced into what's now the United States, but into the Dutch colonies that then became part of the English colonies. As the field expanded, the study began to move beyond sort of the venerable survivors of the 18th century to more recent architecture. Only actually in the last decade or so have shotgun houses become part of the common American parlance in terms of architecture, but historians were beginning to study it. Earlier, you see two examples in New Orleans on the left. Not only is it a specific building type or typology, long and narrow, typically with the gable porch and then 3 rooms behind it, but in terms of the study of the type, it's been suggested that it really reflects the influx of African American or Afro-Caribbean culture into New Orleans, which was a kind of port of entry, bringing actually some African characteristics with it. I won't go into any detail, but that's the kind of thing that vernacular architecture began to be appreciated for its cultural and ethnic, its economic underpinnings in some ways. The term, as we move into the last 20 years or so, began to apply more and more to popular architecture, not so much what you might think of as architecture being built by individuals following kinds of oral traditions and carpentry traditions, but that began to be published in really not architectural journals, although that was happening, but in, as you can see here, illustration from the Cultivator magazine. This went out to farmers all across the country, and they could use it as a kind of model for their farmhouses. And this actually became get rid of, there we go, a kind of common plan for farmhouses at the time. Again, I'm not going to go into any real detail about it, but there's a whole kind of history of this type of plan. It became known as the I House. And there was a scholar in Louisiana, Fred Kniffen, who actually traveled around the country in the 1930s documenting examples of this type of house that were based on these kinds of designs. But here we see, in terms of a sort of cultural history, a shift towards a growing appreciation of American popular culture, which applies as much to architecture, maybe even more so, to music in the 19th century, to literature, to women's literature, all of these things that had been really ignored as people oohed and ahhed over Shakespeare or other high art kinds of productions at the time. And this is moving, of course, in the direction that we will see John documenting in buildings like this gas station in Wisconsin, as you can see here, or this drive-in movie in San Diego. A lot of these don't exist anymore, even though they were photographed at, well, I guess I'm getting old. In the 70s, 77, 79, they were considered very much kind of endangered, and we're moving beyond just popular architecture to this idea of commercial vernacular. Still very popular, but it reflects a kind of individual expression we could think of on the edge in a lot of ways, and it was physically on the edge because a lot of this appeared on the roadways outside of center cities that began to evolve really in the 1920s with the introduction of the Model T, the ability of middle class and eventually working class people to buy automobiles. This evolved slowly. LA actually had more automobiles per capita than any place else in the country, but automobile ownership was growing. And of course, what we find is a kind of architecture that services the automobile. So here you see an example of an early service station, not by John, but photographed by someone else anonymously from the 1920s. These evolved into super service companies of the type that you can see here. Whoop, get the with the service station here, and then markets around there, maybe selling tires, but also groceries and other things of that sort. Here, John did photograph this service station in Wisconsin in 1977. Of course, you can see it's abandoned. There are murals over what used to be the gas pumps. I don't know what the date of this is. I don't know if he did either, but there were remnants of that. This type of automobile-oriented architecture evolved into corner markets, really, of the type that you see here. Again, LA pioneered, I don't want to just focus on LA, but pioneered a lot of this architecture. This eventually would evolve into the supermarket, where actually all of the individual vendors here, you'd have a butcher, you'd have maybe a flower shop, you'd have a bakery, all owned by individual entrepreneurs that eventually were gathered together to become Vons, or the supermarket, where no longer were these kind of individual shops. But you could see people on their way home from work could pull right up, grab what they needed, and head on home. Um, and then we get the development of other types of automobile-oriented architecture here, an early drive-in. You probably have seen films where the waitresses would come out with trays and serve you at your car. So it was really, you could see designs of the automobiles could gather around the central restaurant and kitchen. This evolved into Googie architecture, or drive-in architecture, where the idea was to have, in part, the large windows so people could pull up, but they could see what was going on inside, not just in terms of physical safety, but how were they cooking that food? So a specific building type began to evolve related to that. And this all really began to blossom, initially at least, in the late 20s, but in the 1930s, as highway travel really began to take off. I just have one example here, the most famous, obviously, Route 66, which was actually composed of a series of highways that were connected by the federal government to be renamed US 66, so that you could travel from Chicago to Los Angeles. There were other highways like this crisscrossing the country, as well as smaller roads. And this certainly encouraged a blossoming of new types of architecture, one being the motel. Here we have the motel, or motor hotel, as it was abbreviated, in San Luis Obispo, from 1924. 1925. This was built, still exists, I'll come back to it in a second, on Highway 101 from San Francisco to Los Angeles. It actually was built just midway between LA and San Francisco. 101 being a north-south sort of Route 66 in a lot of ways. This kind of system, however, and this is what motivated John in a lot of ways, was replaced after 1956 by the interstate highway system, which is now, if you travel by car at all across the country, which is worth doing, although not so much on the interstate because it could get pretty boring. But this was intended to facilitate automobile travel across the country. It was under the Eisenhower administration. Dwight Eisenhower had been, of course, a general during World War II. He had observed the Autobahns in Germany. And this was intended really as a kind of American Autobahn system or highway system. And actually, as much as anything, I think as you can read, it was a system of interstate and defense highways, so that missiles and tanks and soldiers could be moved from one part of the country to the other. And that was very much modeled on the German Autobahn sort of military system. But the result was, as is the case now, all of those Route 66s, et cetera, were bypassed. If you drive now on the interstate through Gallup and other cities to Flagstaff, et cetera, on the interstate. You can get off early, and in some places you find remnants of Route 66 and some of the architecture that has survived from that period. Not all of it survived that well. Here is a photograph of the motel in San Luis Obispo not that many years ago. It's actually, I think, been purchased and is now being restored, but there was just a fragment of it left, and I think it was used by bikers traveling around the country at this particular time. But this was certainly the phenomenon that the interstate, and then, as John Margolies talked about and was very aware of, the television, which also kept people at home, and it also was sort of the death threat to the drive-in movie, which is something he photographed a lot. Most of them are abandoned. Some survive, but in fact, there is one, where were we, that we saw recently. Anyway, doesn't matter. Riverside, yes, there's still a drive-in theater there if you want to actually experience that type of entertainment at the time. In any case, John, among other things, referred to himself as an architectural undertaker because he felt he was recording this architecture that, of course, was on its deathbed in a lot of ways. In that sense, what he was doing goes back really to the origin of photography in a lot of ways. And again, I won't belabor this point, but we could go back all the way to the 1850s in France, where a gentleman by the name of Prosper Mérimée initiated or established the Mission Héliographique to record the major antique and medieval monuments of France, which by the 1850s also were endangered to some extent. And this became the first great collection of sort of architectural photography and documentation that John certainly follows in the footsteps of. He commissioned half a dozen major photographers at the time to, such as you can see, Edouard Baldus, really good photographers, but using large format cameras, et cetera, to record these kinds of monuments. This continued, of course, into the 20th century. One of the major later contributors was Eugene Atget. Here you can see a doorway with a relief that he photographed in 1913. More importantly, in some ways, for what we're looking at in the evolution of this kind of documentation from we'll call high style grand architecture and monuments to everyday vernacular. Atget worked for the French government. He sold photographs, and that's how he made his living. But he was a street photographer, and he loved the streets of Paris very much in particular, photographing, you can see commercial storefronts. He loved signage, which looks forward to sort of an interest, certainly, of John Margolies. He photographed streetwalkers and others, but architecturally, these were important. His work for the French government went into the archives in Paris, but in the late 20s, he was discovered by an American artist, photographer, Man Ray, who some of you may know. He had a young woman working for him at the time by the name of Doris Ullman, and just after Atget died, she bought 4,000 or 5,000 of his negatives and brought them back to the United States. I can go back to this for a minute, and really began to reprint the negatives. She introduced a photographer by the name of Walker Evans to Atget's work. And through that, the idea kind of spread, not to everyone, but what we begin to see by the 1930s and into the 40s is more and more of an interest in the American landscape. What we might think of as the cultural landscape of the United States. This was promoted in particular by Roy Stryker, who worked for the Resettlement Association in Washington. He initiated what was known as the Farm Security Administration in 1935. And actually, like the French, he hired probably a dozen at least American photographers to spread out across the country. But mainly by automobile, of course, because it was a big country. But what he wanted was to create a document of American culture during the Depression. Everyday life, really, not, again, great monuments like Hollyhock House, but you can see a service station here by John Vacone from 1940. Walker Evans worked for the Farm Security Administration, as did Doris Ullman. So they were able to spread these kinds of ideas. Evans, in particular, I think you could say is the star of that program and just one of the great photographers of the 20th century in America. But he also traveled around the South, across the West, and photographed buildings like this. Unheard of in most cases because this just was not of interest to people, but it was to him because this reflected near a post office that also was a gas station in Alabama. This was, everyday life for people in Alabama in the small towns, not Paris like Atget. So these ideas began to spread. At the same time, and I'll just mention this briefly, the Historic American Building Survey was founded in 1933, about the same time as the Farm Security Administration. And its focus, again, was on American architecture, but particularly vernacular architecture. So that here, and they used, again, dozens of photographers. Here, views of Rancho Camulas, which some of you may know. It's a historic site. It's still up there in the Santa Clara Valley, and worth a visit if you're thinking about it. But this program continues to the present day, and there are tens of thousands of these photographs, as well as, and I'm not showing these, but plans, drawings, elevations in the Library of Congress, the same place that John's work is. In Washington, D.C. There are also works from the Farm Security Administration by Walker Evans. Here you can see him photographing these churches in a manner that really prefigures how John began to approach roadside architecture in an almost unsentimental kind of way as a document of history of this architecture in particular. In 1971, Walker Evans said that a document has use, talking about his photography, whereas art is really useless. Therefore, art is never a document, though it certainly can adapt that style. And we would think of his work now certainly as art, but he wanted to document American culture. Lots of people. He worked with other authors documenting family life in the South, and James Agee in particular, in terms of his own work. But you can see, consciously or not, I think probably consciously, John approached often his roadside architecture in the same kind of documentary manner, as we can see with the donut hole here, or the Teapot Dome gas station, a little less serious maybe in people's minds, but not to John, I think. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, he started photographing in 1972. Before that, as I'll mention again, he was an architecture critic for major architecture journals, modernist journals in New York, like Progressive Architecture. But then he began to shift in 72. Walker Evans had his first great exhibition in 1971 at the Museum of Modern Art. They published a catalog of his work. At that time, John was in New York. He could not have missed it. And he couldn't have missed photographs like this, which were in that exhibition and in the catalog. Atget revisited in many ways. And in fact, Evans was fascinated with signage. This was American culture. As with Margolies in many ways. And it's interesting, just like John Margolies, Evans collected postcards. He collected signs that he'd steal, I think, from the side of the road. And John did the same thing as he moved around the country. He would go to antique shops, though, and buy travel brochures and maps and other things for sort of his own collection. That related to his fascination with this kind of popular culture, and certainly, there were reflections of, I won't say necessarily Evans directly, but of what was going on. He was, a man, a person of his time, certainly. And one of the things, like with Evans, that really fascinated John were signs. And you can see some in the exhibition, but if you go to the Library of Congress, there are hundreds of these signs. Again, I'd be surprised if any of these still survive today, but just a little collection of the types of things that he liked to photograph. Making a little bit of a leap, but I can't help but do it, to Germany. Some of you may know the work of Bernd and Hilla Becher, two German photographers, artists who began working in the 1960s, actually. Bernd in particular was specifically interested in now industrial archaeology or industrial types of architecture. And they traveled around Europe and eventually the United States photographing, just like with John, what was by this time abandoned and very endangered aspects of German industrial culture, which was really important in the Ruhr Valley and other places around Germany. In a way, it's very interesting to compare to John's work. I can maybe compare it because the first publication of their work in the United States appeared in 1971. And John, getting around being an architectural critic, probably saw this. And it was entitled Anonymous Sculpture. And for that reason, actually, the Bechers became great favorites of the American avant-garde artists, especially the minimalists, because they saw this as a kind of minimalist architecture, especially the cooling towers, as you can see here, all very carefully composed. In contrast, literally, to Margolies, they waited until the sky was overcast because they wanted this white background behind the images. And I don't know if it's very well known, but I had the honor of having lunch with Hilla many years ago, and she was talking about how they would gather up their students to take them with them in a big Volkswagen van. And the job of the students was to clear all of the trees and brush away so that they would get this perfect, sort of precise, I would say very Germanically cool kinds of images. There's a kind of distant reserve and seriousness in this sort of work that maybe we could attribute to John, but John would wait for the blue sky and, of course, was photographing a very different kind of architecture, which maybe unlike the Bechers, where this was considered very avant-garde and cool, was considered to be sort of just roadside kitsch, having no value whatsoever. But of course, John felt differently and really made it his project to document these kinds of elements. What is kind of interesting is that he's really part of a real shift in American art and architecture at the time that leads to postmodernism, a shift away from a modern aesthetic to a postmodern aesthetic. And John was very aware of this. Here is the cover for Ed Richet's famous, it's a fold out, it goes on and on, pamphlet called 36 gas stations isn't quite as monumental, but he photographed between Oklahoma and LA a series of gas stations, such as here you can see in Needles, California, that he appreciated, but not in the same way probably as Margolies, but he certainly drew attention to a kind of new appreciation of roadside architecture, in particular, in certainly his most famous publication, Every Building on the Sunset Strip, from 1966. Now, I'll point out that, and it's not exactly clear, but John actually moved from New York to LA in the late 60s, it seems, around 1970. So he would have known what Richet was doing. He was an architecture critic. He probably was friends with Charles and Ray Eames and the other cool people in LA at the time, which is a pretty small circle, really, of artists and architects at the time. But this was an amazing project. He traveled up and down the entire Sunset Strip in the back of a pickup truck with a kind of modified movie camera. They would stop. He would take a frame using movie film, and photographed, as you can see, every single building. And this does fold out to many, many feet. Rare now if you find one. Well, it's reproduced, but be nice to have an original. In any case, he was refocusing some attention in some ways on popular culture, but his agenda really was to use it for his own art, which was an kind of modernist here, sort of midway maybe, but early painting by him, which you probably all or maybe are familiar with, his Standard Station from 1966. He used his photographs of the 26 gas stations, as the model for this kind of work. And of course, in terms of Ed Richet, the rest is history. He's one of the great, of course, artists of the late 20th and early 20th century. He's still around. We can't dismiss him. The other thing that was going on right at the same time, and so, sort of going back to Germany, a kind of zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, maybe, but again, John probably was familiar with this. Surely he was in some ways. In 1972, the same year he started photographing, we get Learning from Las Vegas, a really, really influential publication by Robert Venturi, his wife Denise Scott Brown, and associate Stephen Eisenhower. They wanted to photograph signage and everyday architecture in Las Vegas. The idea actually started in LA, where Denise Scott Brown was teaching at UCLA. Maybe cross paths with John, I'm not quite sure, but they're here about the same time. Instead, they thought Las Vegas was richer territory, and so they published this work sort of praising everyday popular architecture, including this illustration, which was very influential, in which they tried to make a distinction in terms of popular roadside architecture between what they called the duck, which was inspired actually by this Long Island duck, where duck eggs had been sold in the 1930s. It survived. The Venturis would pass it by and they loved it. And as the duck, as opposed to the decorated shed, the duck was this kind of programmatic architecture, which looked like what it was and what it was supposed to do. The decorated shed, which they particularly loved, was signage, but also buildings that had signs on their facade. And this already had been influencing Robert Venturi here. His big breakthrough, in a way, house for his mother, Vanna Venturi, was called Mother's House outside of Philadelphia, where the house itself became an advertisement for what it was. It's sort of like kids in kindergarten draw a house. Well, a gable and a chimney, right, and a front door. So this became really very much the decorated shed. It advertises itself. We could analyze it further, but you can see the central hearth, the chimney and chimney were the pitched as opposed to flat roof, very anti-modernist at the time. What John had been working with at Progressive Architecture was modern architecture. Here, a great icon, Mies van der Rohe's. You can see Crown Hall, the architecture school at Illinois Institute of Architecture. It couldn't be more radical and naughty, maybe in some ways, in terms of rejection of the modern tradition, which had come to dominate our architecture in Europe and America by the 1960s into the 70s. Some of you may know, the case study program in LA, which promoted modernism all across this particular region. John, by this date, likewise was very much rejecting modernism. And in 1973, among other things, and remember, he was a respected architectural critic in New York, he published an article in Progressive Architecture. The title of the magazine says it all, right? It was progressive, an article called Roadside Mecca on the Madonna Inn, which some of you may know outside of San Luis Obispo. It's still there. And if you can make a reservation early enough, you can stay in the caveman room, for example. There are like 106 rooms, all themed in different ways. It's worth a stop because it's wacky to the extreme. But John loved it, and he really praised, actually, the builders of this, Alex and Phyllis Madonna. Untrained architects. He was a critic, or I mean, he was a contractor, and they just put stuff together that they thought was entertaining and, of course, would attract patrons to their hotel. You can see it from 101. That's the other side from the motel San Luis Obispo. You can't miss it up on the hillside in some ways. And John thought this was really, really wonderful. He praises it in progressive architecture, in particular, compares it to what he calls the sterile franchised reality of a Holiday Inn or Hilton. And he celebrated the sort of idea of untutored popular design. They didn't look to architects. They also were immune to criticism. They didn't care. And maybe this helped inspire John in some ways to move towards the real love of his life, like, of course, the Whale Car Wash. You can see good stuff downstairs. So I'm not going to go over a lot of it, but there is certainly plenty in his work. This certainly maybe a kind of extreme, the Hat and Boots Texaco station. Of course, it's in Seattle, so I guess it's the Hat and Boots, not the Hat and Boots that you might find in Texas. But in a lot of ways, this, maybe not unsurprisingly, has to remind you perhaps of the kind of impishness, can we say, of Andy Warhol. And in fact, one thing that hasn't maybe been widely celebrated, John was part of the circle of Andy Warhol in New York. And in fact, he appears in one of his films briefly, a film called Camp, where he plays the role of Marmar for Margolies, I guess. But again, of course, Warhol was reacting against modernism and introduces this whole new idea of popular architecture or pop art. And I think in many ways, certainly this is what was motivating John in terms of recording all of this. It was an anti-modern project very much for him, not just fun, although he loved it. He was fanatic about it, obviously. If you produce 13,000 photographs of this sort of thing. So he left us with this really amazing record in some ways, which is at the Library of Congress, where we've got the FSA photographs from the 30s, and all of the Historic American Building Survey photographs are there. They're all in the Prints and Photographs collection, and most of it's online, and it's in the public domain to boot. So if you're looking for some illustrations for papers and want to wow your professors, I'd have a look at that. I don't know if you need to go through all 11,000 Margolies photographs for that. But certainly, the fact that John's work is at the Library of Congress is due to their curator of architecture and design, Ford Petrus, who retired a number of years ago, but was there for years. And he engineered the purchasing of John's work. I don't know what the financial arrangements were, but he managed to lasso it in to the Library of Congress, where John was very happy for it to be, because now it's available to anybody in an amazing kind of way. Ford deserves a lot of credit as well. He was there for decades, I guess. I fortunately was fortunate to spend a lot of time with him, because I did a lot of research at the Library of Congress in the prints and photographs room, but he was hard to pin down because he was always busy, always on the phone, always talking to somebody. And part of that was raising money. The Library of Congress doesn't have a big budget. And so he was out looking for donors. One of the projects that he shepherded through was the work of Carol Highsmith, which you can see here. Over since 1980, she's produced 70,000 photographs for the Library of Congress, and they're there. Most of them are online, and these range widely. She's not as obsessed and focused as John. There's a lot of architecture. We always get some old hippies in there on Haight-Ashbury Street, even as you can see, as late as 2012. They hadn't all died out. Some of us are still alive, actually, but don't have quite the hair we used to have, I guess. The other oh, and here, she also took aerial photography. This is part of her archive. You may recognize this place as well, but they go on and on: people, places, landscapes, etc. The other photographer that I think Ford had a lot to do with collecting, but probably other people. We have these, librarians, these federal servants. Federal servants, is that a bad word now? In Washington, who really work hard. And they're really helping to preserve elements of American history and culture that are disappearing. The other photographer who I think, and I'll end with this in a way that is most interesting, is a New York photographer by the name of Camilo Vergara. He's Chilean by birth. He went to Notre Dame. And interestingly, as opposed to, and I didn't mention, I guess John studied art history and journalism, Camilo studied sociology. And since the early 70s, has also produced some 20,000 photographs. And as opposed to roadside, this is urban life. Going right back to Atget, and we know that Camilo certainly knows the work of Atget. He's told us we know him pretty well. But I don't think I need to show Atget again, but with people, unlike John. These are social documents coming from a sociologist in a lot of ways. Wonderful work. He did a lot of work during the pandemic, during the lockdown, to document New York and the boroughs and what people were doing. But also, he did a series that I think are really fascinating. And it shows, of course, his obsession as well of urban African-American, primarily, churches in different parts of the country. He photographed in LA, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Detroit. And here you can see, for example, a church at 4344 West Madison in Chicago, 1981. He went back in 1987, again in 1999 and 2009. The denominations change, the facades change. And actually there are about 6 or 7 of these really kind of incredible record that again, well, as you can tell here, the early photos depict a building that no longer really exists, at least the facade, I guess, of the building. So in ending, I just want to give a kind of shout out, shall we say, to the people at the Library of Congress. The library, I think, is under siege. Their director, Carol Hayden, was recently dismissed after some 10 years with no explanation. And I think you know what's happening to other federal employees who are much disdained, but in fact, working for the Park Service or the Library of Congress are doing incredible work that can't be reproduced. And without them, we would lose these kinds of records. As different as they might seem to be in some ways, urban versus rural, sort of roadside versus the kind of seriousness and spirituality, say, of the African American community. These are irreplaceable. And again, they're all on the website of the Library of Congress. And as I say, I really want to commend people like Ford Petrus, who gets forgotten, but these things wouldn't be there without his perseverance as well, equally as much as John Margolies. So thank you.
We have time for maybe one or two questions before the reception.
And I can answer questions at the reception too, if you have individual.
Hi, thank you. I was curious, you talked early on about John Margolies' photography being driven by automobile architecture. And I think we still have that here in LA, although it looks different than it used to. What comes to mind first for me is the new building at LACMA, which looks like an overpass over Wilshire, whether you like it or not. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about what automobile architecture looks like in LA today and how it's evolved from what it looked like in the 60s and 70s.
Well, it's a really good question. Obviously, the new LACMA building is intended to kind of reflect that freeway architecture in Los Angeles, which of course was much praised. I was going to try to stick him in here too, Rainer Banham and the Four Ecologies of LA, where he actually praises the freeways. The British architectural historian loves LA. Actually, I'll mention, if you don't know it, there's a 1 hour show on YouTube called, what is it, Rainer Banham Loves Los Angeles. It's hilarious. He drives around with this automated speaker and drives around Los Angeles. I'm getting away from your question. Certainly corner markets are, there was just an article, I think, in the New York Times about corner markets, how they're invading New York even, believe it or not, but they derive from the earlier architecture in LA. And one of the interesting things that was noted is how they become public spaces in some ways, probably like the earlier markets as well. But, you know, you go to have your fingernails done or your hair, get donuts, et cetera. And kids now hang out at corner markets. You know, it used to be the mall, so they've even shifted to the automobile. I have to think more about other examples. Do you have something in mind? Anyway, but the automobile, of course, still totally dominates Los Angeles in so many ways. And of course, the whole form of Los Angeles was made possible by the interstate system, especially the freeways in and around LA, moving out into the San Fernando Valley, and that actually hasn't changed that much if you drive around the valley. It's really boring. Sorry, I don't mean to diss anybody from the valley, but because there are places there. But so sorry, I don't have too much more to answer.
Okay, well, we are at time. So at this point, if you have any other questions, if you could make your way to the exhibit gallery, you can ask Dr. Breisch in person. Thank you.